So this will be the fifth installment in this series we've been doing together on media and democracy. And I have a lot more to cover with you. I'm trying to make this be the final installment, but we'll see how far we get. Let me be really brief in reprising. I've suggested to you that there's a distinction between, if you will, friendly and hostile intellectual technology, and that media and media of communication are extremely important in our extended minds, in the way in which we augment our environment in order to facilitate us thinking, in order to compensate for the limitations of our brains, which were not evolved to think with, but which we nevertheless try to use for those purposes. And that the 20th century in general, and especially the 20th century media system, and especially in the United States, I want to suggest, maybe Britain too, maybe other parts of the world as well, we evolved mainly friendly intellectual technology, especially in the media system. We in particular, constituted a media system. I don't want to say it was entirely deliberate or entirely with forethought, but it nevertheless evolved in this way, in which professional journalists were mainly in charge of the content that the media system conveyed, especially in terms of news and knowledge and information sharing, political discourse, and the way in which it was shaped by the contents of the media system. I therefore suggest were curated, managed by professional journalists, and professional journalists mainly did so with a sense of professional ethics that led them to choose to broadcast, to share, to facilitate a national conversation around information that was relevant, that was credible or reliable, that reflected relevant expert knowledge, that contributed to public learning and to civil discourse, even on issues which we disagreed with. I don't want to whitewash or glorify the system. Clearly, it had limits and faults, but I would suggest that one of the hallmarks of a good media system is not that it's perfect or flawless, but that it corrects its faults, and that for the most part, the 20th century saw progress in part because the media system corrected its previous lapses and biases, its narrowness, its constriction, the way in which its corporate ownership was influencing it. And so the media system in the 1970s or 1980s is better than the media system in the 1950s. And that's the result, in part, of professional journalists' self-correction over time. I've suggested that the vast transformation with the assimilation of digital technology into the media system, beginning in the last quarter of the 20th century and really accelerating in the first quarter of the 21st century, has radically transformed our media system in ways that we're still just coming to grips with. And that we see this in the decline of journalists working for newspapers, the decline in newspaper revenues, in the vast and rapid growth of social media platforms, in the large numbers of people who now get their news primarily, or at least in some measure, from social media platforms, in the displacement of professional journalists by amateur news influencers, and in the growing reliance, in particular, of young people on news influencers, on the sense that the alternative media is providing a sense of community, of belonging, of affirmation, overcoming social isolation, or a sense of disempowerment, especially for young people, especially on the right. We talked last week about a number of consequences. Excuse me for 1 second. I want to tick through these very quickly. Among them being, right, that the public sphere, and this will be slightly different from what I did last week. I've expanded the list in part, taking into account some of your feedback. Has just been opened in ways that allow for much more mediated forms of contact, right? What we're doing right now, communicating on Zoom, even though we're on the far sides of a continent. What I do every time I deposit a check using my phone to my bank account, but especially what we do with social media, what we do with our computers, with the internet, with our cell phones, with our digital television, all indicates that our network has opened, connected us, and allowed us to create content in ways that was frankly hard to imagine in the middle of the 20th century. This is a sea change in the public sphere and the media system. And among the consequences is that the media system and the public sphere have become much more porous, much more open to anonymous, and therefore unaccountable, often foreign, sometimes AI generated, often highly manipulative, false content, disinformation that is hard to detect or to hold accountable. And please don't get me wrong. I don't want to suggest that everything out there on social media is AI generated disinformation. But the fact that the distinction between what is true, what is false, what is generated by a human, what is generated by AI, what is produced by a news organization with research and fact checking capabilities and according to standards of ethics, and what is produced by amateurs who are interested primarily in capturing your attention or influence and not in the truth or verifiability, the salience, or the ability to contribute to learning of what they're sharing or doing or saying. The fact that those borders have been rendered invisible, confused, porous, means that we just have a very hard time sorting the wheat from the chaff, the truth from the BS on the new media system. We've shifted into narrow, segmented, partition publics where we primarily communicate with people who already believe what we believe, who affirm our sense of what is true, of what is right, of who we are, and that we are in the right in being that way. And so we are fractured by our media system as opposed to being integrated by our media system. We are confirmed in our prior beliefs rather than having those prior beliefs challenged if they turn out to be problematic, or as John Stuart Mill would point out, it's just important to have your priors challenged in order to make sure you understand the grounds for what you believe, so that, as John Stuart Mill put it, you hold your beliefs the way a human being can, as rationally grounded conviction and not as mere dogma. We profit, right? I shouldn't say we profit. Social media, new media outlets profit primarily not from advertising, but from gathering behavioral data that is used to develop techniques that allow them to model you, to predict how you're going to behave, to sort you, to determine what type of person you are and what is going to be effective in manipulating you. And so this means when we add to the fact that billions of people are using this media system on a daily basis, that this media system collects incredible volumes of information about each one of those people in aggregate, then billions upon billions of data points being collected on a daily basis, the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze all that data, right? If you or I were trying to work with billions of pieces of data, we would simply be awash, overwhelmed. But AI can actually detect patterns and use that information to generate models of types of people and what is going to be effective in manipulating them. And by the way, this new media system allows for real-time experimentation in behavioral model prediction, right? Is this the kind of person who likes sports? If so, do they like basketball or football or baseball? Or are they the kind of person who likes animals? If so, do they like cats and dogs or lions and elephants? Let's figure it out. We don't need to speculate. We can show them that content and see which engages them, and then confirm or disconfirm our hypothesis about the fact that the place they live, the race, the church they attend, the places they shop, the prior patterns of media consumption predict that they're going to like lions and elephants, not baseball or football or cats or dogs. Let's keep going, right? This idea that increasingly mainstream media compete with social media, that the result is that the whole system is behaving more like a social media platform, a platform that does not have editors, that does not have journalists maintaining a threshold of relevance, truth, credibility, ability to contribute to public learning or civil discourse, but instead simply responds to what users most engage with in order to maximize attention capturing and data extraction imperatives, right? And so the idea that even the old legacy media outlets, the ABC, the CBS, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, have to start competing with social media. And that drives them in the direction of responding to content produced by a deprofessionalized quadrant of the media system, where content is produced not in conformity with epistemic or ethical standards, but by algorithms attuned to maximum engagement, irrespective of the reason people engage. And as we've talked about, people tend to engage because the content has emotional impact. It angers them, it frightens them, it outrages them, it titillates them, and very often the content that delivers that kind of effective impact is not the kind of content that is salient, that is edifying, that is politically relevant. We are partitioned and polarized into smaller and smaller media segments or subpublics. We are in those subpublics very much in echo chambers that seal us against hearing arguments we don't want to hear. And the result is not only are we fractured, but it is also the case that, and I'm sorry, the point I think is there is not there. So let me just elaborate for a second. The distinction between the public and the private is blurred, right? What's in private is what I share with the people who I already agree with, I already have affection for, and who I assume, because they're intimate with me, that they're interested in me just because I'm me, right? Whereas what's publicly relevant has to be selected according to its relevance to a much broader audience, to the interests of a group of people who don't have a lot in common other than the fact that they are trying to direct their fates together politically. They're trying to constitute a shared world of knowledge and accountability. And in a sense, the fact that all of this stuff circulates in the public sphere gives stuff that is pseudo public, not really public, the appearance of having passed through the threshold of public relevance, public credibility, even when it isn't. Peer-to-peer communication is frequently anonymous, and the result is that the etiquette of in-person communication falls away, and we're increasingly coarse, mean, bullying, and by the way, we try to just discredit other people rather than responding to their arguments. Finally, public communication increasingly feels like a game. We respond to it not with attention and counter argument, not with sympathy or compassion, but simply with emojis, with likes, with dislikes. We consider success not our capacity to hear and respond to another human being with whom we are establishing an interpersonal relationship, but instead simply by the metric. Did that post get a lot of likes? Did it get a lot of shares? I succeeded, even if the people who are liking it and sharing it are doing so without having understood it, without having really been reached by it. That's a non-human mode of communication, at least in the broader existential significance of a genuine interpersonal connection, an I-thou relationship, which you can establish ideally in a conversation, in communication with others. So, trying to get my slides to advance. For some reason, they're not advancing. Okay, there we go. So I now want to move into new material and to begin to talk about what this is doing to, in particular, political communication and this new field that is increasingly important to our politics called computational politics, right? And I'll point out we have more information on Kamala Harris's campaign than we do on Donald Trump's campaign right now, in part because of the filing of paperwork, in part because more of the expenditures for her campaign went through her campaign as opposed to through super PACs, which tend to be less transparent. What we know is that of the more than $1 billion that Kamala Harris spent in this election, about 80% of her media budget went to online advertising, went to social media or digital advertising, not to mainstream media advertising. And as I pointed out to you last week in talking about the decline of newspaper revenue, part of what we're seeing is a world in which the old mode of advertising, broadcasting, trying to reach as many people as possible and hoping that some subset of those people will actually be persuaded by your advertisement to buy your product, is no longer particularly effective relative to the new alternative, which is digital online communication, in which it is micro-targeted. The person who you are advertising to has been pre-selected to be susceptible to the kind of advertisement you're offering. So let me give a specific example for a moment. If the Trump campaign wants to win Dade County and it sees that there's a large Venezuelan population, maybe 100,000 people, it can create an ad that is targeted to the Venezuelan population. If it believes that Venezuelan men are more likely to be amenable to a certain message than women, it can try to target its message exclusively to Venezuelan men. If it believes that Venezuelan upper middle class men are more amenable to a particular message than are working class men, it can target that message to people who have been pre-selected according to those criteria. It's not exact, right? It's not the case that they have absolutely fail-safe data. But note, more and more data is being shared every day when you do a financial transaction online, when you engage with social media, when you browse the web. That data is being collected, is being aggregated, and is generating a more and more precise profile of who you are, and then the ability to generate using AI, using machine learning, an ad that works for that kind of person is increasingly possible. So we add to this, right? The idea that when you have a micro-targeted media message, when in a given day, maybe your campaign is putting out 1,000 or 5,000 different messages targeted to different groups, the idea that you're going to be held accountable for what you say in that ad. I'm going to go way back to 1984, to Ronald Reagan's famous "There's a Bear in the Woods" advertisement. I hope some of us will remember this, right? There's a bear in the woods, picture of a bear. We don't know if it's a friendly bear or a dangerous bear. Isn't it better to be prepared in case it's a dangerous bear? Vote for Ronald Reagan, right? And then the subtext was that Walter Mondale was too soft on the Soviets, on communism, that it was still dangerous, that we needed to have a more militarized, aggressive stance against the Soviets. And everybody saw that ad. I think it aired during the Super Bowl or some point where it got a lot of attention. And so we could have a public conversation. Is Ronald Reagan right that the appropriate stance to the Soviet Union is a cautionary one because they may still be aggressive? And is Walter Mondale, in fact, not sufficiently alert to the risk that they provide or that they pose to our society? But when the ad is targeted to Venezuelan upper middle class men in Dade County, and there are 1,000 or 5,000 other ads going out on the same day, the likelihood that someone's going to capture that ad and that the media will focus on that ad and that we'll have a conversation about whether that ad was accurate or fair and what it says about the campaign that launched it. Let's say that that campaign says, right, that Kamala Harris is a socialist, that Venezuelans know what it's like to be governed by a socialist, that Kamala Harris will do to the United States what Hugo Chavez did to Venezuela, right? That ad reaches such a narrow, such a small audience that it's very hard to hold the people who created that ad accountable for what that ad says. And so I've got on the board two books here. One of them, Lie Machines by Philip Howard, Oxford University, one of the leading scholars on computational politics. The other, which I consider to be really excellent, I really like Sasha Issenberg's work. It's called Lie Detectives, and he spent part of 2023 and 2024 embedded with the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and both of these books that are last couple years really trying to give us a sense of what electoral politics feels like in the digital age suggest, right, that the emergent computational methods allow political communication to target and model specific individuals. The term that is sometimes used here is the privatization of public communication, right? Kind of an oxymoron, but the idea is what I'm trying to do is make up or to influence your view on publicly relevant topics, but I'm communicating to you almost in a private way, in a micro-targeted way that very few people figure out what's being said other than the target audience. That this occurs in a world in which we have modeled individuals acquiring answers or information about them without directly asking questions, right? We're not doing polling, we're not having focus groups, we're just using the two-way capacity or affordance of the social media to figure out who they are, what they think, what their profile is, and how best to influence them. And so this makes possible subterfuge and opacity. We're not asking for the information, we're gathering. And the result is that you are often unaware that information is being gathered about you and used in order to target you politically. The advances in the behavioral sciences result in a move away from models of rational persuasion. One of the findings in this literature that I find so fascinating is that advertisements in the middle of the 20th century, the period prior to the digital transformation, used words. That may sound like a bit of a funny way to describe something, but the point is that either the print advertisement in the newspaper or the spoken advertisement on the radio or the television were trying to persuade you rationally. They were trying to make an argument. They were trying to say, if you use this product, you will save money, or your laundry will be cleaner, or you will be happier than you currently are with your current product, given these features that our new product has. The new model of advertising is primarily image based, and it's designed to create an association that bypasses rational persuasion. Beautiful people, sexy people, happy people, healthy, strong people use this product, are associated with this product. If you use this product, you're going to be healthy, happy, sexy, successful, etc. Never mind that the product is, soda laden with sugar and chemicals and additives that actually is primarily going to rot your teeth and swell your belly. That's not right. Something that we're trying to rationally persuade you of, in part because we couldn't, but we're going to suggest it instead. And so using refined and realistic models of human behavior. By the way, it's more powerful to use the suggestive imagery than it is to use rational persuasion. And this allows for network-based social engineering, more effective tools of behavioral manipulation. Part of the scandal around Cambridge Analytica in 2016 was the use of these new techniques to appeal to people politically, to engage in political manipulation, in part because the data was stolen from Facebook, or the people at Cambridge Analytica said, we're going to use it only for research, and in fact sold it to the Trump campaign. But as Issenberg points out, look, this is happening in every campaign. It's not just Trump, it's not just Harris, it's the congressional campaigns, it's almost every campaign that has the resources to purchase any kind of sophisticated political consultants is increasingly doing what we thought was scandalous when Trump did it in 2016. Digital networks enable these methods to be experimentally tested in real time and for immediate employment, adding dynamism and speed to molding the public sphere, right? And so, to be as clear as possible, if you run that ad and you figure out, nobody shared it, nobody liked it, nobody really engaged with it, then you tinker with it. And maybe you come up with two new ads. Maybe AI does all of this for you, and you put them out to 50% of your target audience, one, 50% the other, and you see which one draws more engagement, and then you circulate the one that draws more engagement. This is in part how the Trump campaign figured out how to focus on transphobia as a really volatile and persuasive issue in the 2024 campaign. The data, tools, techniques that comprise these methods require access to proprietary, expensive data, right? And so, as I said, if you have the resources to hire a political consultant, the more resources you have, the more effective you can be at doing this. I suspect we're going to see an arms race in campaign expenditure that really doesn't have a ceiling unless or until we do effective campaign finance reform. And so the result is going to be that those who have more money are going to have more and more influence, not only because that tends to be the way of the world, but especially because campaigns are going to be more and more dependent on reaching the people who have less money via paths that cost a lot of money, right? So it's not a surprise that the billionaires are roaming the corridors in Mar-a-Lago in the build-up to the transition to the new Trump administration. By the way, it's not just expensive. It's driven by opaque black box algorithms that we don't know the details of how they operate. They're proprietary, meaning that the people who run X or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok claim that this is their secret sauce and they're not going to divulge the ingredients because it would give their competitors a competitive advantage or take away their competitive advantage. And the result is the rest of us are left in the dark about how our media system is structured. And in particular, because this is so expensive, most of this system is controlled by a few internet platforms with highly concentrated ownership, and as a result, technological and social power is highly concentrated. We've spoken a little bit about the fact that Elon Musk tinkered with, you could say manipulated, the algorithm in X or Twitter, the most influential social media platform for political communication in 2024, to promote content that benefited Donald Trump, to suppress content that benefited Kamala Harris, or alternatively to promote content damaging to Harris, to suppress content damaging to Trump. It's a bit like your television has an external control on the volume. When the news is good for the candidate that the owner of the station likes, the volume goes up. When the news is not so good, the volume goes down to the point where you can barely hear it, right? So all of this to say, for a democratic society to have a public sphere that has been reconfigured by media that have these capacities, these affordances, that do this to political communication, that open the door to these highly manipulative forms of computational politics, is, I think, a further and extremely alarming injury done by the transformation of the media system under these new technological conditions. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to synthesize some of the not quite state of the art literature on this. And I want to be as clear as possible about why. These books are somewhere between a few years old and 5 to 10 years old, but I think they have the most powerful insight into what social media do to the overall network of public communication that constitutes the public sphere and the media system. And they gathered data, did observations in a systematic and sustained way that took years. And in the case of the network propaganda book by Bankler, Ferris, and Roberts, that cost them, I believe, upwards of $100 million to gather all the data. And I don't think we have the current round of publications that have caught up with 2024 yet. So, with the provision that this may be a little bit outdated, this is information we've talked about before in certain ways. This, I think, is enormously helpful. This is from the Yeshai Bankler, Robert Ferris, and Hal Roberts network propaganda book. And it's a peculiar diagram, right? It's a map of media links between different election media sources during 2016. And although it's a little hard to make out, what the map represents through the kind of haze of blue and red is the connections between different media outlets. And what you can see with the large kind of blue-purple cloud and the smaller red cloud is that the media system has essentially bifurcated into two distinct subsystems that communicate a lot with each other but don't interconnect with each other as much. And so this idea of segmentation, of partitioning, of fracturing can be seen objectively, can be observed in the modes of connection between media outlets online. This then, if you go a little bit closer and you see a little bit better, is part of what's happening with the new capacities of this media system. We are connected in interconnecting webs, networks of communication, but it's not all one big network. It's increasingly, in the United States, a partisan partitioning of media systems. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? The mainstream, middle of the road media system includes a lot of sources on the left, a lot of sources in the moderate left, a lot of sources in the middle, all the way over to kind of the Wall Street Journal and mainstream conservative outlets. The media system on the right is smaller, but much further ideologically. And part of the way this map works is it's an ideological spectrum. And I think you can see, right, the purple cloud is in the middle of the spectrum. The red cloud is further out to the ideological extreme. Part of what has happened with MAGA politics, with Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party, is that it has become more ideologically extreme, using anti-trans, anti-immigrant, jingoistic or nativistic political rhetoric has become mainstream, has become acceptable, has become almost obligatory on the right, in part because the media system has normalized that kind of communication and increasingly polices and punishes people who don't subscribe to that kind of communication. The John McCain's or even the Mitch McConnell's of the first decade of the 21st century have been pushed out or reduced in influence in the Republican Party. We see this again in terms of a classification of the distribution of attention according to ideological content. If the ideology is extreme, it appears on the far end of this diagram. If it's moderate, it appears in the middle. And what you can see on the left in the middle is that there's more attention being paid to more moderate information, middle of the road information, median information, you might say. And that's kind of what you expect, that the extremist stuff is only there for a small minority of people. But when you look at the right, the more extreme the opinion, the more attention it gets. That is the new dynamic. And I hate to say it, but I will not be surprised if when we do this research in 2025, 2026 of what happened in 2024, we're going to see the middle and the left starting to move to the more extreme views as well. And that's in part because this is what this media system does to our communication. Finally, again, this is familiar, I emphasize that in the 20th century, we had a media system, particularly the news and information system, the system that furnished the material that became the subject for our political communication, that was policed by media professionals, journalists, who were truth sensitive, who would call out each other if the information they provided was not accurate, was not reliable, was not well sourced. And the result was a kind of reality check dynamic. If the material being reported on is stuff that the audience laps up, but it's not true, it's going to be exposed as such, discredited, and the journalists who propagated it are going to be punished. Alternatively, right? And this is where I think the broader effect of new media, digital media, especially social media, is increasingly transforming even legacy mainstream media. What we have on Fox News, what we have on Breitbart, what we have on other right wing television, radio, online media outlets is a propaganda feedback loop, an identity confirmation dynamic where the media police themselves and each other to provide only identity confirming news, news that is in conformity with your prior beliefs, with the kinds of people who are already part of this political community. And the result is very often that disinformation circulates widely, that it becomes obligatory. The example that I think is extremely illuminating, we now know as a result of the Fox News lawsuit with the Dominion electronic balloting machine company and the settlement there, the disclosure, the court documents reveal very clearly that the vast majority of the journalists and producers at Fox News did not believe what they were saying, knew that it was false, knew that the Dominion machines were reliable, or at least that they hadn't been hacked to convert votes for Donald Trump into votes for Joe Biden. And yet they continued to say what was false, what was publicly damaging, what undermined people's faith in their electoral system, what led to much, excuse me, much more polarized political opinion, much greater mistrust not only of the electoral system, but of each other. And they did so because if they didn't, their audience went elsewhere because they were hearing in social media, they were hearing online, they were hearing through other outlets that Joe Biden had stolen an election, that Donald Trump had actually won, and they needed to understand how that happened. Dominion was part of the answer to that question. And though Fox News ultimately paid $750 million to Dominion, it turns out that that was a rounding error, basically, that this model was highly profitable for Fox News, even if it was highly damaging to American democracy. Again, material we've talked about a little bit before, but in scientific theory in particular, this is Philosophy of Science, the O'Connor and Weatherall book. I'll go back to just show you the cover for a moment, the misinformation age, right? Our old friend, what is that called? The cross between the rabbit and the antelope, is that a rabbalope? Something like that.
Jackalope.
Say it again.
Jackalope.
Jackalope, thank you. Yes, so the jackalope, and the focus of their work is on the structure of networks of opinion formation, especially the opinion formation in scientific communities. And so if everybody is communicating with somebody they're proximate with, you get a cycle. If there's some central figure, kind of the node that is the hub for communication, they're more influential. If everybody's communicating with everybody, you get a complete network. And their claim is relatively simple, relatively straightforward. If you're interested in true opinion, ultimately displacing, replacing, discrediting false opinion, the true opinion needs to be able to reach people who are receptive to it. And the structure of the network, as well as the confidence that the people have in the true opinion, as opposed to the confidence that they have in the alternative, influences how readily the network opens itself to rational persuasion. So this is right time step 1 to 6, and eventually the entire scientific community becomes convinced of the true theory and highly certain that the true theory is better than the alternative theory. And on the other hand, if we have insulated networks, if we have what I'm calling a partition public, or if we have networks that don't intersect with each other at all, you don't have that capacity of the better argument, the better claim, the more persuasive narrative, the more urgent need to ultimately compel attention and conviction and to bring people round to seeing things the right way. And the concern obviously is that we've moved over into a network of communication that insulates us from hearing arguments, concerns, claims, needs that are relevant to public opinion formation. The evidence for this, we've talked about this before, right? Is that when a Republican is a president, Republicans generally think the economy is going swimmingly. Democrats are much less convinced. A Democrat becomes president, the sides flip, and they flip again, and they flip again, right? And note, it's not just that our understanding of the economy, our consumer sentiment, is mediated by our partisan perspective. That influences us apparently more than the actual economic conditions we're encountering in our lives. It's also the case that there is a stronger partisan bias on the part of Republicans than there is on the part of Democrats. And I've suggested to you that is because Republicans occupy a more insular and more extreme media environment, which is shaping their opinion about how the economy is doing. And by the way, please note we're in the middle of one of these swings right now with Republicans in light of the election of Donald Trump all of a sudden showing a skyrocketing increase in consumer confidence. And Democrats, despite the fact that in many ways the economy appears to be quite robust, the stock market probably totally overvalued, but nevertheless doing extremely well, Democrat consumer sentiment is plummeting in light of the fact that Donald Trump is coming into office. Some of that may be rational, right? You may worry that Donald Trump is going to impose tariffs and deport migrants, and those things are going to be damaging for the economy, that he may even try to interfere with the independence of the Federal Reserve, and that may undermine confidence in the reliability of America on the international stage. But having said all of that, I think a large part of this is reflective of the way in which our media environment is influencing our consumer sentiment. So let me try to make one more argument with you today, one more claim, one more piece of analysis. And this is, to put it simply, that if you are convinced by everything we've talked about for the last 4.5 weeks that the media system is in bad shape, that as a result of that, our public sphere is also damaged. If the consequence is that our political communication is increasingly not doing the work that a democracy needs from its public sphere, and additionally, if our society is increasingly disintegrating, is increasingly prone to false belief, if that is damaging us as a society, how should we address this? What should we do about this? And the first, and it's a negative claim I want to make, is that we shouldn't think this is going to be solved by politics alone, not by law alone. Political public sphere reform, or broader cultural public sphere reform, media reform, cannot be pursued exclusively through political regulation, because it is not the right tool and unlikely to have success. And so my suggestion is that, as opposed to that, we need to use ethical, cultural, technological resources to pursue reform. Let me start developing the reason. One of them is a pragmatic or practical claim to do with the nature of public spheres. The political public sphere, right? The place we have our political conversations is deeply connected with the general public sphere, the place we go to appreciate music trends, to watch our sports, to learn about the new developments in quantum mechanics, or the worry about the spread of an avian flu bug and whether it's going to move across the zoonotic barrier and become something that can affect us as humans, right? That the idea that the general public sphere is valuable to us for the roles it plays in cultural, aesthetic, scientific, what I'm calling identitarian. What community do I belong to? How do I want to express myself? What kind of identity do I want to develop? That it plays all those roles that are separate from political public opinion formation, and independently valued. And so if we just say this is democratically damaging, let's take over the social media companies. Look at what's happening with TikTok, right? 70% of Americans don't want TikTok banned. And by the way, I want to be clear about this. I'm very ambivalent about that ban. I think that there's an argument that is being made in a very limited way. TikTok is gathering information and data about its users. By the way, so is Facebook, so is Google, so is Instagram, so is YouTube. But those companies are not owned by the Chinese, and we worry that the Chinese are a hostile government that has shown itself willing to steal our technology and to try to intervene in our politics. Why wouldn't they use the data if they can get their hands on it that TikTok has to contribute to those campaigns? I think that that's a sound argument. I think the part that's neglected is, well, why wouldn't Elon Musk do the same thing? Why won't the people who buy the data from Facebook or Google do the same thing? It's not only China that may have a quote sinister interest in using the data that social media helps them to gather. There are, in addition to those pragmatic reasons, and I'm sorry, I was using the example of TikTok. 70% of people don't want TikTok banned, not because they don't take the argument seriously, just because they like TikTok, because it allows them to see content that is important to them for cultural, aesthetic, scientific, identitarian reasons. We value the media system beyond its role in our politics. In terms now of more narrowly normative democratic philosophy or theory, we are a society with a fairly absolutist understanding of the freedom of speech, right? We have the First Amendment, and it's been interpreted to basically prohibit all governmental regulation of speech that has anything to do with its content or anything to do with anything other than clear and immediate danger to the public, right? And I want to note that you don't have to be a free speech absolutist to believe that there's importance in respecting freedom of speech, thought, opinion, inquiry, and that we should have broad principled limitations on the way in which we can coercively intervene in and regulate the public sphere. That's part of protecting democracy and the kind of politics that we rely on. And so without saying that that's an absolute prohibition, I want to say that's a weighty consideration we have to put in the scale as we measure the cost of proposed regulations, and that may lead us to be a little bit wary of too much regulation of a social media environment, even when we recognize that it is damaging us. Final consideration for today, I know I went a little bit over time, is that we need to respect the limits of political legitimacy, right? And so when saying that, what I want to suggest is that a controversial law that does something that a lot of people are going to object to, bans TikTok, right? Or requires that Facebook meet certain regulatory standards, is going to need to be democratically legitimate. Most people are going to have to be persuaded that it's a good law, that there are good reasons to support it. And I think in the climate we're in right now, especially, we're just so fragmented, we're so fractured. And please note, right, telling roughly half of the population you belong to a media system that leads you to have false beliefs, to be prey to disinformation. And by the way, my half of the population subscribes to a better media system, and we have right beliefs, and therefore we're going to regulate your media system. That's going to look like a tyranny of the majority or a tyranny of the minority, not like democratically legitimate reform. And I think we do have to take seriously that we shouldn't do things in the name of protecting democracy that actually, in a sense, seem to betray that very commitment. We end up looking hypocritical if we do so. All right, so I will come back to this list when we get together next week and continue going through the reasons why we shouldn't do this by law alone. And then I will just preview very quickly. No, I won't, because my slides are not set up this way, but that I want to start taking us into the idea of a public health approach to regulating social media, something that the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has been very strongly involved with, and the idea that we might be able to do this better using the ethical resources of a public health approach, persuading ourselves that what we're doing is not good for ourselves, not good for our democracy, not good for each other, rather than simply trying to impose political regulation. All right, that's where we're going. We'll do that together in person next week. For today, I want to open it up. Questions, thoughts, things you want to discuss. Who wants to start us out? Anybody? Stunned silence, please. I know you well enough. Somebody's got something to say. Who is it today? All right. If there's nobody out there, I'm gonna let you go. Going once, going twice. Have happy New Year's. Enjoy the remainder of the weekend. Looking forward to seeing you in person there next week. Be well, everyone. Happy New Year. Take care. Bye bye, guys.